Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about something that is no joke, an absolute game changer if you work with APIs. I'm talking about API chaining. You know that pain, right? When you have to test a workflow that jumps between a bunch of different API calls? Well, if that sounds familiar, you're in the right place. All right, so to really get this, let's start with a problem. A super common one, actually. And it perfectly sets the stage for why we even need something like API chaining in the first place. So imagine this. You're working on your app. You send a post request, and bam, a new user is created. The API gives you back a success message and, most importantly, a shiny new user ID. Awesome, right? But now what? How do you take that ID and immediately check if it worked? Like fire off a GET request to make sure that user is actually in the database?
Well, the manual way is just a total grind. Seriously. You run the first request, then you've got to squint at the JSON response to find the ID. Okay, found it. Now you highlight it, you copy it, you open up another request tab, you paste that ID into the URL, and then you can finally run the second request. It's painfully slow, it's super boring, and let's be honest, you're going to make a typo eventually. This whole process just doesn't scale.
But of course, there has to be a better way, right? And there is. This whole manual copy-paste nightmare is exactly the problem that API chaining is built to solve. Okay, so what is API chaining really? Let's break it down. I want you to think of it like a relay race. But instead of passing a baton, you're passing data from one runner to the next. At its heart, it's a technique where the response from one API call automatically becomes the input for the next one. You're literally creating a linked chain of requests that run one after another, all on their own. So the flow is super simple, but it's really powerful. Request 1 goes out, a little script grabs, say, the user ID from the response, and then boom, request 2 instantly uses that ID as its own input. And the best part? You don't have to do a thing. It's all automatic. All right, so that's the what. Now for the how. How does this magic actually happen? Let's get into the mechanics, and we'll use a nice, simple local API to see it in action. So for our example, let's pretend we've got a little student API running on our machine, and we want to test a common workflow. First, we'll create a student, then we'll check that the student was created correctly, and finally, we'll delete them to clean everything up. A simple 3-step chain. The whole secret sauce behind this is a simple 3-step loop. It's always the same. First, you capture the data you need from the response, like that new student's ID. Second, you store that ID in a variable. And third, you reuse that variable in your next request. Capture, store, reuse. That's it. And check this out. This one line of code is where the magic happens. This is a bit of Postman script. That command, pm.environment.set, that's our store step. All it's doing is taking the ID from the JSON response, that's the json.id part, and saving it to a variable we're calling ID. Simple as that. And here's the payoff. This is the reuse step. See that ID in the URL? Those double curly braces are special. That's how we tell Postman, hey, go grab that ID variable we just saved and stick its value right here. And it does, automatically. The chain is complete. Okay, pretty cool, right? But that was easy mode, a simple local API. Let's level up. Let's see how this works in the wild, with a real-world remote API that needs things like authentication tokens, the stuff you actually deal with day to day.
So what's the big jump here? Well, we're going from a local API to a remote one. This new one, an API called GoRest, needs a bearer token to prove we're allowed to use it. And we're not just doing a couple of steps anymore. We're going to chain together a full CRUD workflow.
Yeah, the whole shebang. CRUD. You've probably heard of it. Create, read, update, and delete. We're going to chain all 4 of these together. We'll create a user, grab their ID, use that ID to make sure they're there, use it again to change their info, and then finally use it one last time to clean up and delete them. A complete user lifecycle totally automated. All right, now for some pro moves. These are the tips that'll take your tests from just working to being truly solid and repeatable. And we'll start with a problem that you will absolutely run into, probably on day 1. Just think about it for a second. Your create user test needs an email, right? So you put in test@example.com. The first time you run it, works great. But then you run it again. What happens? Failure. The API says, nope, that email is already taken. Your test just broke because of old data. The solution is actually pretty slick. You just generate new data every single time you run the test. With a little pre-request script, like this one-liner in JavaScript, you can create a totally random string. Tack that onto an email address, and voila, a brand new, unique email for every single test run. Problem solved.
Okay, last pro tip, and this one's important. Good automation is clean automation. It cleans up after itself. So, just like we created those variables on the fly, we should also get rid of them when we're done. So here's what the full professional workflow looks like. You create your variables dynamically before the test starts. You run your whole API chain, then in the script for the very last request, in our example, the delete call, you get rid of all those temporary variables. That way, you start fresh every single time. And this is the command that does the cleaning. It's the opposite of what we saw before. pm.environment.set creates the variable. pm.environment.unset destroys it. You pop this into your last test, and your environment stays perfectly clean. So, at the end of the day, here's the big takeaway. API chaining isn't just some cool feature. It's a really powerful way of thinking. It lets you stitch together individual API calls and turn them into a fully automated test that actually mimics how a real person would use your application. And that's really what it's all about, applying this to your own projects. So I'll leave you with this question to think about. What complex workflows, what user journeys are you still testing by hand right now? Now you know how you can automate them. Thanks so much for tuning in.